everybody. This is Adam Serwer with Mother Jones, and you're watching Adamize. I'm here with Robert George, editorial writer for the New York Post. He also blogs at Ragged Thots. Robert, how are you doing?
Great, Adam. Thank you for inviting me here. It was a real pleasure.
Well, it's great. Well, thanks for coming. So today we're talking about, today the first thing we're going to talk about is the sort of rapid fall of Mitt Romney in the esteem of the Republican Party.
I'm sorry. The fall of who? Who?
Yeah, exactly. Following his remark that Barack Obama won the election in part by doling out lavish gifts to various demographic groups that are part of the Democratic coalition. And I'm just sort of, this has been sort of weird for me to watch. I mean, I always sort of thought that it would be like John Kerry, where he sort of fades away and people sort of forget how much they really sort of liked him at the time. But it's just happening so quickly, and I'm curious to hear why you think that's the case.
Well, first of all, remember, in both the cases of the two most recent, before Romney, the two most recent failed presidential candidates, both of them were senators. John McCain in 2008, John Kerry in 2004. They're basically able to go back to what could be considered, their day jobs, and still be part of the process, part of the debate. I mean, that John Kerry's has rejuvenated himself to the point where people talking about him as Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense and so forth. McCain, even though the party had always had problematic relationship with him, come back after 2008, after he lost to Obama and realized that he hated Obama much more than he hated Bush, years before, he ended up coming. He joined the party and was one of the, and remains one of the president's big major critics. Romney, has never been part of the party structure. He was the Northeastern liberal governor of Massachusetts. Before that, he was a businessman, and so forth. So he's never had all of these relationships, political relationships, going back years to and have all that goodwill to kind of fall back on. Now, when you add that to the fact that if you'd gone back 2 years ago and saw all the energy that the Tea Party brought into the Republican Party, Mitt Romney would probably be the very last person that you would have thought would have emerged on the other side of that and ended up being the presidential candidate. You might have foreseen somebody like like a Mike Huckabee, or maybe some other governor, somebody that has more roots from the stronger roots with the different parts of the Republican base. But anyway, we ended up with Mitt Romney, and he kind of solidified himself strongly at the first debate, mainly because he remembered something that had emerged through the Republican process, that any individual that seemed like there was the fiercest person who was willing to take it to the president, the base responded to that. There was like this sort of adrenaline rush. And so any doubts that the different parts of the base had about Romney were very, very briefly eliminated at that first debate, because he came out like gangbusters and the president was on his heels. And as I'm sure you know, the flip side of that was the panic attack that went through the Democratic base, and Andrew Sullivan, was throwing up his arms.
That's going to go down in history, I think, is the sort of proto-example of like how liberals were killing.
That's exactly.
Right after the first debate.
So anyway, when you come out at the end of all that, then of course we see what proceeds, and the president wins, and the base suddenly realizes, okay, this guy was never our guy. He was not. He was not. He had no connections with the social conservatives. He had no real connections with the economic conservatives. He obviously had connections on the business side of the Republican Party. But now when he's talking about these things like these gifts, it's just a complete, a total wrong tone. It really makes it. He really is seeing things as a businessman would kind of see things. And actually, not even a good businessman, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. But he sees the political process as purely transactional. That the president was offering up these things for bids. I'll give the Dream Act to the immigrants, to the Hispanics over there. I'm not even sure what they were imagining they were giving blacks. Something over here. I'll give young people student loans. I'll give women contraception. It's all purely transactional. You'll get these bennies from the government, and in response, you're not going to vote for me.
So I'm gonna defend Mitt Romney for a second, at least sort of. I'm not gonna entirely defend him.
Now this now puts you in the interesting category of being in the same place as maybe Marco Rubio, who as maybe the only people who are defending Mitt Romney. But go ahead.
Well, I think I won't defend the tone of his statement. I think that the notion I don't like the use of gifts to describe what Barack Obama did. I think I think Obama made people's lives easier with some of the things that he did, and he very clearly, I don't think it's. What I'll say is this: I think it's like pretty basic politics to reward the constituencies that put you in office. I think Republicans do it. I think Democrats do it. If Mitt Romney had become president, he wanted to expand the Navy. He wanted to do, raise military spending to something like a very high percentage of GDP. He never really got extremely specific about it, but he wanted to cut taxes on the wealthy, or on high earners. There's definitely there is something transactional about politics in the sense that you support people not just for emotional, cultural reasons, but also because what have you done for me lately? And I don't think that that's a wrong way for voters to look at it. I will say that I was offended by the use of gifts, because it wasn't, when some of the things he mentioned, the delayed deportation for Dream Act, potential Dream Act eligible students. I mean, these are people who are working hard, they're going to college, or they want to serve in the military. I mean, these are, and they're here, they don't have citizenship, not because, they're terribly lazy or don't work hard. It's because they were brought here as children by their parents, who decided to, come across or overstay overstay their tourist visas or whatever, but they're not here because they decided to be here, and so I don't think they should be punished for that. The same is true, my view of the whole contraception thing is that, it's part of, when your employer agrees to pay for your health insurance, I don't think that they get to pick and choose, what health insurance pays for, any more than they get to be mad if you spend, you blow your whole salary on video games and whiskey. So I think the concept, this idea of rewarding your political constituencies is almost banal, and that Romney's problem seems to be that he expressed it in the most sort of condescending, dismissive possible way.
And it brought back obviously the whole 47% stuff,
right?
Which is going to go down in history as one of those, Michael Kinsley always called it, that classic, the real definition of a gaffe when a politician actually says what he or she truly means, and it comes out. And I think it was the second debate, he backtracked on it, and he said, I want to be the president of 100% of the people, but we're going again into this area again where he says, he's atomizing with a T, not a D, atomizing the electorate again, and I think that this, for a large segment of the Republican people, of the Republican Party who had been supporting him, they just basically said, they'd had enough, and they figured, it's time for you to move on. And ironically enough, Mitt Romney turns out to be the gift that the Republican Party is now saying return to sender.
Right. Yeah. I mean, well, so here's the other thing about what Mitt said, though, is that, I sort of understand why the Republican Party would want to disavow this, given the sort of narrative. There's been a very big overarching demographic narrative, which I think is like an oversimplification of what happened. But why they would want to say, like, sort of disavow this. But if you watch Fox News, I mean, this is the overwhelmingly, the Bill O'Reilly, Sean Hannity, this is what they have drawn from the election, or like Rush Limbaugh is, it's hard to vote against Santa Claus. I mean, it's not like Mitt Romney was saying something that a lot of other Republicans weren't saying. Now, obviously a lot of Republicans were saying that this is a completely wrong way to look at it. But, it's not like this came out of nowhere and Mitt Romney is the only person who would think this, and he only thinks this because he's an out-of-touch rich guy. There's a lot of other, or particularly out-of-touch rich guy. I mean, there's a lot of other conservatives who are making similar arguments.
Yeah, I mean, it is a variation of, I guess Paul Ryan refers to it as the makers versus takers argument, and somebody else. The other, if you obviously you're on Twitter, and the reference there is kind of a caustic. The free stuff group. We can't compete because the electorate has basically become a bunch of people looking for free stuff. I understand kind of where they're coming from, and I think there is obviously a legitimate debate to be had about how many people are drawing on public benefits of some sort or another. I think, though, as a political tactic, it doesn't really. It's counterproductive, and I think we're seeing. And just the backtrack you're seeing from a number of people, say, whether they believe it or not, shows that they realize that it's politically toxic. But obviously, in a bigger sense, you'll also realize that the way the entitlements structure is set up, you also have these issues where there are many individuals on the lower end of the economic scale who they're obviously contributing to Social Security and Medicare and things like that. Mm-hmm. And because of the way that the structure is set up now, you've got poor people who are money is being taken out of their Social Security contributions and going to wealthier, if not wealthier retirees. So in a society like here, where there's a lot of different kinds of distribution going on, there are many people who are makers and takers at different times in their work cycle.
Right. It's not a clean. There's not like a clean. It's not like a clean division. Everybody makes and takes at some point.
Exactly. But this is most unhelpful, obviously, for Republicans who are still trying to kind of figure out what hit them a couple of weeks ago, and I said they're kind of happy to see Mitt Romney hit the road right now.
One of the things that I find interesting about all this, right, is this sort of part of the sort of free gifts argument is this question of demographics, and this almost gets talked about as though it's sort of a given that, say, Latinos and Black people are going to vote Democratic no matter what. And I just my problem with the sort of overarching demographic argument is that the Black vote being loyal to Democrats is the result of a fairly long transition away from the Republican Party. my grandparents who were African American were Republicans until Kennedy. I think Roosevelt, the first time, Franklin Roosevelt, the first time he ran for president, he got like 20% of the black vote. It was like a very low percentage. And sort of, there's been, the black vote is very, is the Democratic Party's perhaps most loyal constituency at this point, but that's the result of, the Democratic Party delivering on some fairly big things back in the 60s, and now, first black president. But you look at the Latino vote, and this transition of Latino vote towards the Democratic Party is I think the biggest argument against the idea that this is just a matter of demographics, or that people who are Hispanic are somehow somehow more likely than everybody else to necessarily support democratic ideals just because, or I think the ugliest version of this is something like, I think it was Mark Stein who said, they come from socialist countries and they want to recreate that here, something like that, which I thought was, really stupid. But the biggest argument against this is that George W. Bush got something like 40% of the Latino vote against John Kerry back in 2004. And there was once a faction of the Republican Party that was really intent on delivering for delivering things that Latinos wanted, was really interested in serving that constituency, and that faction of the Republican Party has sort of shrunk and may be on the resurgence now. But it's pretty clear to me that it's not just a matter of demographics; it's a matter of it's a matter of policy, and not just policy, but also I think tone. I mean, I do think it made a huge difference that George W. Bush, in particular, did not talk about immigration as though he would prefer there were fewer Latinos in the United States, and I think that's sort of a trap that the Republican Party has gotten into since sort of scuttling Bush's immigration bill, and I think particularly in terms of losing that constituency in numbers that they never used to lose it before. I think that's a big problem.
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, first of all, I mean, not only did George W. Bush, not see Latinos as a problem,
right.
He and to his credit, Karl Rove saw them as an opportunity, and that of course comes out of the different ways that Texas and Texas Republicans see Hispanics, and say California deals with that issue, and because of the border with Mexico, George W. Bush and Rick Perry, who succeeded him, sees. I mean, obviously they realize that they've got issues with illegal immigration and things like that, but there's much more of almost a familial, a good neighborly relationship between Mexico and Texas, and so Bush had a very different way of looking at the immigration problem. But unfortunately, you had this rebellion within the ranks of the Republican Party in the mid 2000s, and the immigration issue was shot down by Republicans, predominantly obviously Republicans in the Senate. And now the party has been sort of adrift on this issue. Now, going back to the previous topic, Mitt Romney exacerbated that by trying to come across as the hardest of the hard on immigration, and he's the one who coined this very nice little phrase, this self-deportation, which I'm sure
Well, he actually didn't come up with it. He used it, but that's a long stint. I think the Mark Krikorian at the Center for Immigration Studies, I think, may have been the person who came up with it, but he certainly was one of the earliest to use it. This concept of attrition through enforcement, quote unquote, which is to make life not to sort of round up and deport everyone, but to make life so miserable for undocumented immigrants that they
yeah,
decided
but
to leave.
obviously, I mean, this shows the power of a presidential campaign, and particularly when the person who comes out as the nominee, and that seems to be he may not have coined it, he sort of popularized it, and so he becomes the face of how the Republican Party feels about immigrants. And we're talking about how a lot of Republicans were responding viscerally against Romney on the gifts issue. I thought it was interesting that one of the people who's been most aggressive on pushing back on Romney on this is Bobby Jindal, and I think there really is I really think the immigration issue kind of ties into this, because something that my one-time boss Newt Gingrich observed over the last few days is that.
Newt Gingrich, who is very sensible on immigration in the primary.
Who's always been, I mean, and as I said, I work for him, and I can say this. Who's always been sensitive on this issue, and he was quoted just a few days ago as saying, in responding to Romney on the gifts issue, well, even if what you're saying is true, he said, I don't think it's true. Even if it is, how do you explain that Asian Americans who are they're a smaller part of the voting population, but it's about 3 or 4% of the vote. They voted for Romney. They voted for Obama in a greater percentage that Hispanics did, 73% versus the 71% that Hispanics got, and I mean, while you've got different segments of the
and this is another constituency that was trending towards Bush back in the day.
And it's even. I mean, it's a group. I mean, obviously there are different segments in it, but I mean, it's more.
That's just with the Latino
yeah,
community.
Right.
It's like everybody's coming from different. Like it's Latino and Asian American are very much umbrella terms that encompass a wide spectrum of culture.
That is true, but if you could make certain I mean, the Republicans here maybe say, well, Hispanics should be with us because they're very, very family oriented, and a lot of them are pro-life and more conservative on the social issues and so forth. But you could also make the argument that a number of the Asian communities, when you focus on being in terms of being very, 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 very entrepreneurial and also having a strong sense of family, they should be kind of a natural get for the Republicans. And again, they went Democrat in a larger percentage than Hispanics. And I'm really thinking, and this is just a theory, but it would be interesting to see what some of the poll numbers are. I mean, if you're hearing self-deportation and a sort of even if they're talking about illegal immigration, but a flavor of, well, we're not. Too many people are coming into the country and so forth, and we don't want them here. If you're first generation, or if you're immigrants and you're trying to bring your family here, you're going to be looking at, okay, which is the party that seems to be hostile to this notion, and which is the party that seems, if not friendly to it, at least is doing a sort of do no harm, or let's try and figure out what the problem is. And so I think Bobby Jindal, who obviously being the first Southeast Asian descendant person to be governor, I think he's particularly sensitive to that, and I think that, I mean, if you look at Jindal.
Well, he's also just the right guy.
If you look at Jindal,
I mean, if you were looking to push back on Mitt Romney, the Republican Party isn't just if you want to say the Republican Party is the party of the American dream, as Jindal is something that Jindal has been saying, it sounds much more realistic coming from an immigrant who became governor of Louisiana than or someone from a family of immigrants who became governor of Louisiana, within a couple of generations. Than Mitt Romney, whose father was a wealthy, famous politician. It's all well and good for Mitt Romney to talk about the American dream, but then when Bobby Jindal talks about it, it actually sounds like it might. Well, be true.
That's absolutely right. And but what I thought was really fascinating, if you look and if you just look at Jindal's body language and the kind of passion on this, if you just see some of those video clips of him in the last couple of days talking about this, and you contrast it with his response to, I think, Obama's either first or second State of the Union, where people were talking, he looked like the NBC page kind of thing. This was a very much more forceful, passionate individual articulating this, which leads me to believe that it's something that's really coming from his core, from who he is, and he's not just going through the political talking points. And you then contrast that, ironically enough, with Marco Rubio, who seemed to be willing to give Romney a pass on the gift side. So I think that you may see down the road a rather interesting. Well, obviously there's this internal debate going on in the party, but in terms of the people who are going to be leading the two sides of it, you've got Jindal, who sounds like he wants to be kind of aggressive and remaking the party to be more inclusive, and particularly can be a little bit more aggressive on immigration and how you talk about these issues. And then Marco Rubio, who admittedly has put forward his own version of the DREAM Act and so forth, seems to be wanting to be more, maybe slightly more establishment. Again, we're talking just kind of levels of tone here. But I thought it was interesting that Jindal, coming from that Asian background, being the more aggressive going against Romney. Rubio, obviously Hispanic, Cuban, and so forth, being more establishment and not wanting to criticize Romney as much.
Well, I think we're seeing the beginnings of the 2016 race.
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
These are two of the people who Republicans are most excited about. I'd give sort of Rubio the edge in terms of excitement right now.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it's the edge in terms of excitement or the edge in terms of desperation, because right now they're looking at the Hispanics were 10% of the voting bloc this time around, and it could be, I don't know, 12, 13 percent come 2016, and so obviously there's a feeling that. And admittedly, Rubio gave a fantastic speech at the Republican convention, and so he certainly has the opportunity to take that and make the leap the same way that Obama did from 2004 to 2008.
Right. It did feel like bizarro 2004 in that sense too. You came away from the Republican convention sort of thinking that Republicans were sort of wishing they could vote for Rubio this year instead of Romney.
That's right. But speaking about demographics, so this is something that I found quite amusing for some time right now. If you look and try and project at a possible Republican presidential debate. Republican primary presidential debate, come late 2015, early 2016, you could see up on the stage Bobby Jindal, Marco Rubio, possibly Nikki Haley, possibly Susana Martinez, and obviously people like Paul Ryan, Chris Christie, Jeb Bush is also possibly in that mix. But my thought is that the Republican field arguably is going to be far more diverse in terms of ethnicity, gender, and so forth than what we could anticipate on the Democratic side right now. Obviously,
no, that's true. That would be it's very possible that would be an interesting outcome.
Right, exactly. And the thing is, all of these are people who would have a major head start on the Democrats, because obviously they've all won statewide. at least once. I mean, Christie obviously has got an election next year. Paul Ryan would not have won statewide, but obviously he's a major figure in the party. But once you win statewide, that gives you much more voice, much more power to take your to make your tours to Iowa and New Hampshire and so forth. Now, on the Democratic side, you've got obviously you've got Hillary, and the other people out there are Mark Warner, Chris Cuomo, and so forth. It seems like Hillary and primarily a bunch of white men, and then you contrast with what the Republican Party might have. So it's funny that the demographics at the base level in terms of voters and so forth seem to be working against the Republicans, but the demographics in terms of the diversity of their potential presidential and vice presidential pool is pretty broad.
Well, so I think that I just want to say one thing about Rubio, which is that I think there may be some Republicans who are who being way too reliant on the sort of demographic argument. Like Rubio, and getting to the point about Latinos being, Latino being an umbrella term for a very wide spectrum of cultures and backgrounds. Rubio is a Cuban American from Florida, and that I think that's going to resonate a lot in Florida. But I don't think it necessarily translates to a stronger Latino support, nationwide. And I think Rubio knows that, and I think that's part of why he's sort of trying to stake out a middle ground on immigration, as far as this sort of watered down Dream Act that he's proposed. As a sort of, and the way it's watered down for people who don't know is that it grants legal permanent residency with a possibility of citizenship down the road, as opposed to giving a path to citizenship almost immediately. Which again, path to citizenship, we're talking about years here. So basically, it's not immediate amnesty or whatever. But I think it would be a mistake for the Republican Party to think that sticking a Latino American at the top of the ticket, or sticking Rubio at the top of the ticket, is automatically going to solve their sort of demographic issue, or is going to make Latinos feel more welcome voting Republican, or as welcome as they seem to used to feel. And you could see this pretty much everywhere. I think it was like maybe it was 2004, 2006. It was like a sort of year of the Black Republican, where I think like Michael Steele was running for Senate in Maryland, and there was just all this speculation. And none of these guys who were running for none of these Black Republicans who were running for statewide office actually won. And it was just sort of like, it was assumed that they would siphon off this like large percentage of the Black vote, and they of course didn't. And I mean, Archer Davis sort of learned this the hard way, right? That simply being, it's not enough to be a Black candidate. You also have to actually do what Black voters want you to support, the policies Black voters want you to support.
Well, yeah, but keep in mind, Archer Davis, well, first of all, he didn't even get out of the Democratic primary in Alabama. But keep in mind, he was running running as a Democrat, and in a very conservative state. I think though, winning statewide as a Black candidate is difficult, regardless of what party
Yeah, that's certainly true. It's reflected in the Senate.
The mirror image of Michael Steele in 2006 was Harold Ford Jr. in Tennessee. There you got a Democrat, very a very savvy politician who won a really really great race, but ended up losing, and basically his political career kind of ended at that point, and he ended up moving to New York, and so forth. I mean, it's a remarkable that you can think about the number of black candidates that have won statewide big races, probably maybe on one hand, and you've got Deval Patrick, and actually a couple of them are from Massachusetts. Deval Patrick and Ed Brooke, the former senator going back a few decades. Obviously, Barack Obama, and Illinois actually has managed to Carol Moseley Braun as well. But the point, going to your point, you're going to definitely have there's a lot of difference between what Cuban Americans are going to be wanting in a candidate versus Puerto Ricans versus Mexican versus a Mexican American, Central America, and so forth. But I think that is true. I'm not sure. It hasn't really been tested per se at a national level. So I mean, it will be. It's going to be interesting to see what would happen if there is a breakout Latino candidate, and whether there will be intracultural tensions and intracultural support within the quote Latino community or communities, as I could say. You're right. I'm not quite sure how that is going to play out, but I thought it is interesting, and you know this, that remarkably it seems that Obama actually narrowly won the Cuban vote in Florida, and if that's the case, that actually.
I'm actually very skeptical.
Well, I was a little bit but first of all, because I know that Bill Clinton almost won it in 1996. I think he ended up with 48 or 49%, maybe a little bit off because it was a three-way race. But he came very close to it. But if Obama did actually win a majority of Cubans, that presents even more headaches for Republicans in competing in Florida.
So at first, when I saw those numbers, my eyes popped out of my head. But the reason I'm a little more skeptical of them now is like a little while after the sort of original exit polls came out, showing that there's a group called Latino Decisions, which basically has the best public opinion research on the Latino electorate in the United States, like just bar none. And one of the things that I did, like before the election, I wrote a piece that was basically like it was basically arguing based on their data that the public pollsters were undercounting Obama's Latino vote in Colorado, Florida, and Nevada. Colorado showed a tight race or Romney winning. Florida, I think, was trending slightly blue towards the end of the race, but Romney had been winning most of the time. And of course, Nevada, Obama was leading in that state, but he won by a larger margin than expected. He won by a much larger margin in Colorado than expected, and he actually won Florida. It's a shock to a lot of Republicans.
The same thing. It's exactly the same thing that happened in 2010 when Harry Reid ended up coming from behind and winning there, and Michael Bennet, and I think you're right. I think Latino decisions pointed out that the reason why that happened in 2010 was the undercounting of the Latino vote, and that exactly same thing played out again this year.
So I will say one thing, but as far as the whole argument about demographics goes, I think Democrats are way too confident if they think that this is going to last. In terms of there's this like sort of permanent lock on the Latino vote, particularly if they don't deliver on certain priorities that Latino voters are rightfully demanding as a basis for their support. But I think one of the ways that Latino Decisions mentions that the polling undercounts Latino voters is that it tends to oversample English dominant, better off Latinos as opposed to more working class Latinos who may work weird hours, may not have landlines, maybe Spanish dominant, and I think just in general, you're going to see a certain kind of I think you're going to see, particularly with Latinos, a kind of the same thing that happened, with white ethnics in the sort of 60s to 70s, where I think there's going to be a certain percentage of Latinos who, as they become sort of wealthier and more established, are going to drift into the Republican Party, and so the Democrats are going to lose part of that vote anyway. I don't think it's actually, it's definitely not. I don't think that Democrats are really going to be able to rely. I think that they can just sort of, sit on and expect to continue to get this high a percentage of the Latino vote, absent some pretty serious accomplishments.
There are no permanent political majorities or permanent political coalitions, but temporary ones can stick around for a while. So I mean, if this particular coalition that has kind of been put together in 2008, 2012 sticks around, that could mean a couple, like 2 out of 3 or 3 out of 4 of the next of the next presidential elections, which is a worry. I mean I was looking at the map after the election, and I was thinking to myself, what if I don't think she's going to, but if Hillary Clinton runs in 2016 and she gets the nomination, is there any state that Obama won that she shouldn't be considered a favorite in? Number one, and then you think states that he may either not competed in at all or maybe lost narrowly, that she may have a better appeal to, because she saw in 2008 there was she resonated with a lot of the white working class that was somewhat diffident towards President Obama. So, and then you think about her background in Arkansas. So I'm thinking, is there a reason why she wouldn't be able to be competitive in Arkansas, West Virginia, North Carolina again? And then you look at the rest of that coalition. I mean, that is something that the Republican Party would have to be seriously worried about, has to give serious thought about in terms of looking at that, looking at that eventuality. The flip side of that is, if 2016 turned out to be, political pundits either dream or nightmare, depending on the way you look at it, of a Hillary Clinton versus Jeb Bush. Jeb Bush, in certain ways, might even be more of an attractive candidate to diverse Latino constituencies and say than Marco Rubio. I mean, his wife is Mexican, Mexican, I believe, yes, and he had like his brother, like George W. Bush, has a very very different way of dealing with immigration issues and ways of making Latino voters feel welcome, while obviously having a socially conservative viewpoint. And it also his education reform was something that was very very successful, very very popular among Latinos in Florida as well. So you're right. I mean, you could have a Jeb Bush versus a Hillary Clinton, and Jeb Bush may be able to poach parts of that coalition that Mitt Romney obviously couldn't. Flip side of that is, of course, Hillary Clinton may be able to be more, may be able to draw more white working class as well. So I mean, you're right. These coalitions don't stick around forever, but the one that Obama has put together, is it could be problematic. Could be problematic for Republicans if they don't get their act together.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I believe I believe we're sort of heading towards the end now, but I believe you wanted to discuss something a little off the topic of the aftermath of the last presidential election, which was the rise of the black nerd in American pop culture, which I think is like a topic that is interesting, but that people have been sort of discussing for the last few years. And I'm just interested to hear your thoughts.
Well, yeah, I mean, it may have been part of a discussion in some circles, but it kind of hit me over the last few weeks. I mean, if you go back in terms of TV supporting characters and things like that over the decades, the black supporting character has usually been sort of the out there, loud, not so much an idiot, but just kind of out there in your face, Jimmy Walker, JJ kind of thing in the 70s. In the 80s, with the Cosby Show, we had like the different world spin-off, which showed a number of different middle class young blacks.
Of course, Dwayne Wayne.
Dwayne Wayne,
but who's like a genuinely like interested, also like not a caricature. And
well, yeah, exactly. But it seemed though, but that obviously was coming from a place where it's kind of black creators and people kind of like knew different aspects of the community and so forth. Most of the situation comedies, most of them are predominantly written by white creators and so forth. And but so I noticed recently there were basically like kind of 4 shows out there that this kind of I was starting to see this new kind of a kind of character kind of popping up. One just actually was recently canceled on USA. It's called Fairly Legal, where a lawyer decides to become a mediator and so forth. Anyway, the legal assistant there is this guy named Leonardo Prince, who is this kind of online role-playing kind of Star Wars, World of Warcraft kind of following guy, and he's played by this stand-up comedian named Baron Vaughn, and it's dresses kind of in a kind of offbeat manner as well. But I mean, it's fascinating because I mean, here's a guy who's like he's very very smart, funny as well, but it's not your kind of average character. Then there's on Fox there's on Ben and Kate. There's this other character, Tommy, who's the best friend of Ben in the show, and is always crushing on Kate as well. And he's got this kind of he's got this this hipster vibe about him. Don't Trust the Bee in Apartment 23 has another stand-up comic, Eric Andre, who plays.
I'm a big fan.
Well, no, it's funny. I mean, Eric Andre and Baron Vaughn both come from sort of this kind of this New York kind of boho-ish black comedy kind of troupe, and they've worked together. I mean, Eric Andre. I mean, as you probably know, I mean, he's got this insane.
He's got this like whole Andy Kaufman like craziness. Like I don't watch Don't Trust the Bitch in Apartment 23. Or B, I don't actually watch the show. I don't know what it's called, but I do watch the Eric Andre show on Cartoon Network, which is just like a crazy like gonzo nuts comedy show where like sometimes he'll have like actual celebrities and sometimes he'll have people like really poorly impersonating actual celebrities. I just think it's one of the funniest.
Well, and I mean, I saw him do this like years ago before I even knew who he was. Like 2000, probably about 2007, 2008. Actually, I think it was right around the time Obama was coming up, and they had like this sort of black comedy festival in New York. You're right, and Eric Andre in the show is both he and the one of the white lead characters are basically victims of the market meltdown, and they both end up having to get jobs in like a coffee coffee shop kind of thing, and so and he has this like there's this off-air creepy anorexic girlfriend that's always referred to, and we've never actually seen. But yeah, I mean, it's about as, I mean, it is so far from what he does on the Eric Andre show as anything. But and then finally on the show that's actually been kind of like my favorite comedy of the last 2 or 3 years, Happy Endings, where Damon Wayans Jr., who plays Brad Williams, and he's married to married to a white girl, but he's so neurotic on the show that he loses his job, then gets another job. But his wife is so happy that he hasn't been working so hard and so forth that he fakes being unemployed. And he basically tells his wife that he's still unemployed, but he's getting in touch with himself, and he's happy. He's just staying at home doing nothing now and all this other kind of stuff. Which, I mean, there's a regular conceit on sitcoms where a guy will lose his job and then hide it from everybody. He'll like go in and everybody thinks he's still working and he's not working. So, but I mean, it was just kind of very interesting that you're seeing I think a more complex and a more diverse kind of black supporting characters, particularly black males. They're dysfunctional in much more of a middle class kind of.
Yeah, there's definitely a class orientation to this type of character, and I think it has. So, if I were to put forth a theory, two things. Number one is growing up, I went to a mostly white elementary school when I came back to the United States. I spent a lot of my early childhood abroad because my father's in the Foreign Service. But when I came back, I went to a mostly white elementary school, and then I went to a mostly black middle school and high school. And what I found actually was that, contrary to sort of stereotype, my nerdy inclinations were far more accepted among black kids, and were not considered like marks of pariahdom, like everything from being smart to liking comic books and video games and stuff like that. That was not. That didn't ostracize me in the way that it was kind of nerdy in my elementary school to be into those things. And I think largely what you're seeing on television with sort of the emergence of this sort of nerdy black character is pretty much just
it's your generation is growing up. It's grown up and has taken over the world, Adam.
I think it's more just that it's not that Hollywood is diversifying much in terms of writers, but the writers who come to Hollywood now have had actual meaningful friendships with black people, whether in college or otherwise, and I think particularly in college. And I think that's why it's sort of the sort of class sensibilities of the black nerd are reflected in the characters that you're discussing. They have an idea of how to write a black character who isn't the stereotypical black character of yore, and they may not have a great sense of how to place that character in context within the black community, but they do know sort of what this person is like within their sort of circle of friends, and they've gotten pretty good at doing that.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, and in fact, Happy Endings went a little kind of close, not close to the edge, but it touched a little bit about on that in I think in its second season last year, where Brad would occasionally disappear, and
and he'd hang out with his
black friends, and his best friend among the group, Max, a white guy who's gay and is very unstereotypical gay as well. He couldn't understand why he was disappearing and why he wasn't including him, and that was actually they didn't go on a big kind of social trip with this, but there was.
It wasn't really preachy, but it was describing something that I think really happened.
That really happens, where African American young professionals are feeling perfectly assimilated and so forth. But sometimes just want to hang out hang out with hang out with other African American men or an African American group and so forth. And it's not that they're turning radical and turning away from their white friends and so forth. There's just this sort of cultural bonding moment that everybody needs every now and then.
Yeah, I thought that was actually a pretty well handled episode in terms of describing a phenomenon that genuinely exists, and that I think is sort of uncomfortable for people to talk about. And they made it I remember that episode, and they made it funny, and it was definitely realistic in terms of they're just it's for some reason. Even people who live in fairly integrated lives in terms of the worlds that they live in, social worlds I think remain pretty separate, or can remain pretty separate.
Well, yeah, I think so, and but they do remain separate. But they also sometimes realize that you sometimes need to you need to give the different parts of your own personality and your own character room to breathe in different kind of circumstances, and so sometimes my background, for example, I was born in Trinidad, then moved to England, then came to New York, and then United States and so forth. Sometimes it may be hanging out with black professionals, maybe sometimes hanging out with West Indian friends or relatives or whatever. There's different parts of you that need to be fed, and sometimes you don't always want the same food. You need to hang out in a different restaurant. I was thinking.
I think it's actually a great place to end things. Robert, thank you so much for coming on Adamize, and hopefully we'll get started again.
I hope so. Thank you. This was really great. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks a lot. Take care, Robert.